Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is David Tarus, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Association for Christian Theological Education in Africa, ACTEA. ACTEA's mission is to strengthen theological education through accreditation, research, and capacity building in order to serve the church and transform society. In today's webinar, we are going to have a guest facilitator who has been part of ACTEA network for a very long time, and that is Dr. Linzay Rinquest. I'm going to read his bio before inviting him to continue. I'm taking the call from a hotel in Ghana, where we are attending a consultation for executive leaders in partnership with a partner called Bosco Partners. After completing basic theological education for ordination as a Baptist minister, Dr. Rinquest entered pastoral ministry as a bivocational pastor, while at the same time continuing postgraduate theological education at the University of Stellenbosch in Cape Town in the area of Old Testament, eventually completing the Doctor of Theology qualification. For many years, he served in associational and national executive capacities and leadership, including as the presidency of the Baptist Union of Southern Africa. He currently serves as an elder in his local church and is engaged in an adjunct online teaching role and supervising postgraduate students with the Cape Town Baptist Seminary and the South African Theological Seminary. He spent over 20 years in theological education as a lecturer, registrar, academic dean, and principal, with a major responsibility in fundraising. He served as an engagement director with scholar leaders in the Vital Sustainability Initiative program, but has transitioned into an independent consultancy role in theological education. Linzay is married and has 3 young adult children. Now it's my pleasure to officially welcome Dr. Linzay to continue with the topic of the day, and that is fundraising for theological education. You're welcome, Linzay. Maybe we can pray so that you can continue. Apologies for that.
Yeah, please do that.
Father, we thank you so much this afternoon. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for the gift of technology. And even, Lord, as we are going to have this very important topic on sustainability of mission through fundraising, I pray for Dr. Linzay that you will bless him and bless all of us and help us to understand and to renew our schools for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. You're welcome, Linzay.
Amen.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Tarus, and greetings everyone who's currently present on this webinar. Allow me to say that it is a tremendous privilege as well as an honor to be able to share with you today what has been my own experience and what I have come to learn and understand, having been involved in the Ministry of Theological Education. That is still very much a passion for me. And having served at a particular seminary and been involved with many others in different roles, to be able to share with you something that has been a large part of more than a decade of my own experience in this area, having had the privilege of being trained by a number of people to be able to develop my own capacity in the whole endeavor of fundraising in theological education, especially having served as a seminary president for 14 years, in which when I went into that role, beside the many aspirations that I had, it had been made abundantly clear to me that one of my major responsibilities would be the ongoing financial sustainability of the institution, and especially to play the leading role within making sure that we've got enough funds to be able to do what we believe the Lord has called us to do. So it is great for me to have been able to have done that. Along the way, I've had many mentors, but in particular, I'm very grateful for having been a mentee of which at the time was the only full-time Christian fundraiser in South Africa, who himself had been trained in various areas of life, but had for many years worked with one of the largest consultancies in fundraising in South Africa called Downsbury International. And I had the privilege of being trained by him, especially when he came alongside me at our institution. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today are some of the experiences and the insights that I learned and that I had to implement in order to do that, and also had the opportunity of sharing this with a number of other institutions. So I guess as we come to a topic like this, there are a number of things that is probably going to be important for us to be aware of as we get involved in the issue of fundraising in theological education. I know that many of you are feeling the challenge of this responsibility. As you know, there are many Christian institutions that at the moment are really struggling and battling to make ends meet, and wondering where is the funding going to come for our next month or maybe even for the next year to be able to fulfill this very, very important task and ministry that the Lord has called us to. And so you might be coming in looking for some quick formulas and magic answers, but I'm wanting to say to you that unfortunately, if you've come for some magic and quick answers, there is no such thing in fundraising in theological education. However, there is a lot of wisdom that is there, that I've been the privilege of having been at the receiving end of and implementing, and had great measures of success in that. But in order to help us along, I think I want to lay some of the groundwork for some of the issues and the topics that we're needing to cover, because this is a big topic. It's a massive topic. It's a huge challenge and responsibilities. And I know that many of you may already have had experience in this. You're already busy doing it, and some of you might have your own experience and your own insights and wisdom that I'm hoping you're going to be able to share with us later on. But I'm going to be telling you a little bit of my own journey and my own experience and what I've learned as to what has helped me to become successful as a fundraiser in theological education, especially as the leader of an institution. So why is fundraising important for theological education? Well, there are many possible answers to this question. I want to share some of that, some of the realities that we are facing in theological education. One of it is the current economic challenges facing theological education. This is not just true for us on the continent of Africa. And as you heard, I'm calling in from probably, which is the southernmost person at the moment on the continent on this call. I'm based in Cape Town in South Africa. And so when we take a look at this issue, it is not just an African issue, it is actually a global issue as far as theological education is concerned. There are significant economic challenges facing theological education. In which, if you are like me and you like to see what's happening in the world of theological education and the challenges that others are experiencing, I think just this fairly recent report, and there have been other reports following this one from Christianity Today, where in an article entitled Outlook Apocalyptic for UK Theology Schools, Anthony Royal, who serves as the head of the King's Evangelical Divinity School in Southeast England, told his colleagues that it seems like 50% of Christian Bible colleges in the UK will close in the next year or two. And we have seen how this has been true, not just in the United Kingdom, but also in other places, where theological education has had a foothold for many years, including the United States. So there are articles I can share with you that comes from the United States. But just recently, one of the most the most historic colleges, Baptist colleges in the UK closed down. That is Spurgeon's College, purely because of finances. And so this is a reality. You know, it is not a prophecy. It is a reality that many are facing. But when we take a look at the economic realities of theological education, you know, there are some very good resources, and one of the important resources is this book, Leading Financial Sustainability in Theological Education by Dr. Emmanuel Ballon. You know, right in the beginning of the book, he says the following: endemic financial challenges will continue to negatively impact theological education in Africa. The carcasses of struggling institutions littering every corner of the continent bear witness to this prognosis. Yet these ailing institutions are still hopeful that somehow a contextually relevant remedy will emerge to set them on a path to financial sustainability. So there's the hope, and there is the desire that we all need to have, and that we do have, in view of the fact that, you know, we serve a God who has promised that he will never leave us or forsake us, even in the midst of the global economic challenges facing theological education, but also the realities that we face on our continent economically, especially in the area of theological education. So what exactly do these economic realities of theological education mean? Well, I think we can pause here and just take a brief look at what might typically be happening at your institution. You know, having worked with many institutions in a previous role across our continent and in other countries, I've seen this reality playing itself out when we take a look at where it is that we get our sources of revenue, our sources of income in theological education. Now, this might not exactly be true for your institution, but on average, this is the kind of thing that we see normally playing out. That theological institutions generally get their income from at least three sources. The first being tuition, and under tuition, we could include, you know, if we have accommodation, you know, if students were to be paying us rental for on-campus accommodation, or from some other services that we might be offering them. But often, the greatest income that we receive from our students will be from tuition, what they actually pay for their studies. And what we have discovered is that for most institutions, the tuition that we receive from our students in most of our programs, in relation to the income that we would need in order to balance our budget, generally accounts for only about 40% of our income. Now, that's the average figure. You know, for some people, it would be higher. You know, I know of some institutions who have been able to exceed 50%, but nobody normally exceeds 60% of the income that they need from tuition. The general pattern is that 40% of the income will come from tuition, which therefore means that we have to find additional sources of income. And those additional sources of income will normally come from donations, and those donations could come from many different sources. You know, some institutions are connected with denominations, so you might get a denominational subsidy or what is called a subvention. Some of you might not be connected with denominations. You might be private, completely private. You might be completely independent, and so you might be getting donations from individuals or other source of income that is donated to you. And then others have also ventured into what are called third stream sources of income. In other words, some kind of business venture that the institution will get involved in. I'm not going to be talking so much about third stream income. However, when we take a look at that, the reality then is that the funding that we need in order to be able to operate basically tends to be larger than what the income that is normally kind of guaranteed. And we know the struggles that we often go through, you know, as students themselves struggle with the issue of affordability. And so very often we have to supply them with scholarships, or they have to find scholarships elsewhere, or we have to find unique ways of helping them to subsidize their studies. But then generally, the funds that we need to raise typically accounts for 60% of our budgeted income. And all of that then needs to cover our expenses for any given year. So that when we take a look, and I've looked at this across many different institutions, and I found once again this to be the general pattern. The general and typical costs that we face in the majority world, especially in Africa, is that then that 100% income we then have to split between staffing costs like salaries, and that generally could take up to 60% of your disposable income. For some institutions, it's even higher than that. I've worked with institutions where their salaries account for 70% of your income available. And normally, if you cross the 65% of your income for salaries, you're normally entering into what we would call finance critical, because then the resources that you need financially to be able to cover your operational costs, and that could vary from one context to another. But this this breakdown over here is typical for what I found for many institutions and seminaries in Africa. We maybe will spend up to 20% on utilities, including fuel, because many institutions have to generate their own electricity. And so they have to spend money, on diesel, for example, to be able to run generators, and that is a very significant and a very debilitating cost. And then the rest we have to split, and typically what happens is, in order to function, we have to pay at least our ICT and internet access, maintenance, our library and administration. And just looking at these figures over here shows you, maintenance normally takes such a lot, even in a given year, to be able to spend. And so spending only 5% of your income, of your disposable income for a year on maintenance, is part of the reason why, many of our institutions are struggling, and many of our facilities have fallen into disrepair over the years. But I think, what this pattern should be illustrating to us is that there is often this great imbalance that we face. And that imbalance is that we end up having to subsidize our students up to 60% of the actual costs of running the institution. And so that is often what puts us into a situation of crisis. As a result of that, as part of this economic realities that we are facing in theological education, I have come to certain conclusions, as I actually see these things playing out, what I call financial truisms in theological education. Now we can debate this, and some of you might say that it's not exactly true for me or for our school, and that is wonderful. But now I'm speaking in generalizations when I take a look at what's happening across our continent and in many other contexts. And these are some of those truisms. Education is always subsidized, as students can never actually pay the actual costs of their training. We also need to realize that every student is a cost, and therefore more is not necessarily better. So I've been in contexts in which people have said, well, the more students we add, the more financially sustainable we will become. Now that might be true to some degree, because sometimes we are able to, and we do report rather, that we could do with more students because we have the capacity to do that in terms of student number ratios, in terms of what the capacity is of our infrastructure to be able to do that. Under those circumstances, we would say yes, it is good and it is necessary to add students. But adding students doesn't necessarily mean you will have more disposable income, because as I think as we have seen earlier, we're always needing to subsidize students, and then there are other costs that we're often not aware of. Sometimes we want to just add more academic programs, more specializations, but we don't seem to realize that academic programs in themselves are expensive to roll out, and the cost thereof often costs more than what we anticipate. So those are just some of the truisms in that area, in which there are two others I wish to share. And that is this, that if we take a look at our current budget, many institutions say, yes, but we are meeting our budget. We are balancing our budget. And even if that is true, what I discover is that that is likely happening because we are underpaying our faculty and our staff. So yes, we might be paying 60% of our disposable income on our salaries of the faculty and our staff. But the question is this, are we offering not even competitive salaries, but livable salaries? And I've been in many contexts where I've seen that, where leaders of theological institutions and the folk who are teaching, they complain and say, they are struggling to make ends meet. And that's part of the reason why we might actually be balancing our budget, because, we, as it were, we are robbing Peter to pay Paul. We are underpaying our faculty. But then besides that, besides meeting the budget through maybe under remuneration, what then tends to also happen is we tend to defer maintenance and shortchange development. So I've been to many institutions as part of previous programs and other initiatives, and I see this, and many of our institutions, it's falling apart. It hasn't been painted in years. The student accommodation is not up to scratch. Sometimes it's not even livable. And part of the reason for that is we just don't have the money to be able to pay for maintenance. And so we're deferring maintenance, and the deferring of maintenance often means greater costs down the road. And so those are some of the economic realities that we face, and that presents us with a challenge. And so for us as schools in Africa, African schools, what we have noticed, have generally not yet fully embraced fundraising. I do believe that every school in Africa is involved in some form of fundraising, but we often are not as intentional as what we need to be. And maybe because we haven't fully embraced it. In 2011, I was privileged to be part of what was then called Overseas Council International. They're now part of MISA Global. But, they still do. They ran institutes for excellence in Christian leadership development, and the one that particularly focused on sustainability in 2011, in which I attended and in which I was able to be part of the presenters. OCI at the time had done a study of theological education and institutions in Africa, just to see what some of those trends are. And these were some of the trends that they reported. And these trends were, you can remember, even though it's now a while back, it was also before COVID, but these were what they reported. African seminaries are dependent on tuition. African seminaries are less dependent on donations. Almost half of African seminaries now see smaller proportion of income from gifts. African seminaries are less likely to be dependent on foreign sources. More than half of African seminaries have seen decreased proportions of foreign income. So a lot of this reporting, could be seen as being positive, meaning that maybe because things are going well, we are seeing these trends. But there's also a negative part to this, in which this is part of the challenge that we are facing, that we are just seemingly not also keeping up with some of those challenges. So, in order to summarize that, I'm wanting to say that while there are numerous factors that affect the financial sustainability of theological education in Africa, one of the big ones that I haven't spoken of here is just the whole history, of the development of theological education in Africa. But those things have been well documented, in books as well as in journal articles. So I don't need to make mention of that, as to how, many of our schools, for example, have been the product of missionary endeavors, in which a lot of the funding came from those missionaries and the organizations that sent them. And as we have seen the gradual exit of some of those missionaries, back to their sending countries or for various reasons, we've also seen the exit of those funds, and so that has also impacted here. But an initiative in fundraising will continue, therefore, to be crucial for the future of theological education, especially on our continent. So I'm not wanting to preach to us, but I think sometimes it is important that we remind ourselves, that while the word fundraising in itself might not be in the Bible, I do believe there are some biblical foundations, that lays that foundation for us to maybe help us to see that the call and the need for fundraising is not an unbiblical exercise. Just to maybe reference two portions of scripture that I think amongst many that could be used. I'm wanting to say to us, and once again, this is not a devotion, this is not an exegetical lesson. A close reading of scripture often demonstrates that God supplied finances via human efforts and their participation. Let me give you two examples of that. Think, for example, of when God's people in the Old Testament were traveling through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And there was the desire and the need to build this mobile place of worship called the tabernacle. Listen to what God says to Moses. Tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering for me from everyone whose heart prompts them to give. And that offering was specifically so that the tabernacle could be built. So God could have just, through the wave of his hand or the word of his mouth, spoken the tabernacle into being. But no, he brought his people to participate in that process. Think, for example, in the New Testament, when the churches were in need, the apostles, like the Apostle Paul, engaged in a collection, to share with those in need. And then he makes reference in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 3, to the church in Macedonia, a church that was by no means an affluent or wealthy church. But he says of them, for I testify that they, meaning the church in Macedonia, gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Once again, in order to respond to the needs of people, they engaged in the taking up of a collection. Now, I'm wanting to also say that as much as what there are challenges that we are facing in theological education, there are also some myths that I believe we need to dispel that will help us to embrace, what is the opportunities in theological education and to what that can mean, for our ongoing ministry. So let me just then share with you some of those myths. And some of these myths is connected to some of the issues I've mentioned earlier. For example, that there's a magic wand in creating funds. I know that prosperity gospel has got quite an influence in Africa, and often those who are part of the prosperity gospel, are seemingly doing very well, and sometimes I hear many of us within our evangelical circles kind of decrying that fact, and weeping that fact, that they seem to be doing well and we are struggling, what is the magic formula, But we know, that often the prosperity gospel is nothing else but, and I say this with respect, this is my opinion, it's nothing else but a glorified Christian pyramid scheme, and it doesn't actually speak to the realities of bigger issues that we will call issues like Christian stewardship. This one that I've mentioned before, I've heard that by simply adding more students, we will become more sustainable. It is partly true, especially if we are below the optimal number of students that we need in order just for our ministry to make sense, to make financial sense in terms of the proportion that we have in relation to our faculty capacity and our facilities, So if we've got an institution that could cater for, say, 200 students and we only have 50, then clearly, there's a problem there. And then adding students will help us to be more sustainable, but it's not going to guarantee long-term financial sustainability. The other way in which that is often approached, which seems to work in certain contexts, that by diversifying our offerings, we will become more profitable. So for example, we have seen many examples of this, not just in our continent, but elsewhere, that besides just doing theology or training people in areas of Christian ministry, Sometimes we expand and we become Christian universities, or seminaries within the context of a liberal arts college, etc. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong about that, because I believe that is sometimes part of the mission to which God is calling us to, especially given the context in which we are. But, as we have seen earlier, as I mentioned earlier, by adding other programs, we often don't realize that while that will give us income, it does come with overheads, with costs, that we often underestimate, and that sometimes we think is going to help us to kind of cross-subsidize what we are doing in terms of our primary focus, our primary ministry in theological education. But then it often doesn't turn out that way, because the burden of being like a Christian university or a Christian liberal arts college often comes with other challenges, the cost of accreditation, having more specialized people teaching, etc. That can be very difficult. And what others have said is that fundraising just simply doesn't work in Africa. I don't believe that. I've seen it happening, not just in South Africa, across our continent, that there are people who have embraced this and they have done well. So, while there may not be a magic formula that will guarantee financial sustainability or a move beyond to what we often call as what should be the goal of fundraising, and that is advancement. Because fundraising often means just trying to get enough to live from hand to mouth, just enough to help us to balance our budget. That, I think, is a good goal. It's an honorable goal. It should be our first objective, through our fundraising activities, to at least make sure we are able to meet our operational budget for any given year. But I think, if we are thinking long term, if we are thinking, and we do not know when Christ is going to return, but should our Lord tarry for much longer still, it means that we would want to continue doing what we are doing way into the future. And part of what will get us there is to try and think beyond just living from hand to mouth, just meeting our basic operational needs, but to try and see if there isn't a surplus that we could build into our systems, especially financially, so that we can move just from fundraising for basic sustainability towards advancement, in which we are able to become the leaders in certain areas of ministry, to be at the coalface of many aspects as far as ministry is concerned. And I believe that the only thing that will help us to get us there, besides the grace of the Lord or any miracles that the Lord might bring our way as institutions, it is going to be through an intentional process of fundraising. And so that is why it is important that we must just learn to try and dispel the myths. These myths, these things that we sometimes tend to hold on to, but those things often tend to keep us back. So how are we going to be doing that? I believe it is that we have to be more intentional around fundraising. Now, there's lots of research that's been done in this area, especially within what we call the non-profit sector. Here's just one quote I picked from a resource that I have. And this is done by a group called Third Space Studio. And what they do is they do an annual survey of what's happening within the non-profit sector, not just in theological education, but in many different kind of non-profit organizations. So in the year 2014, in fact, in the preceding year, they completed a survey of 87 non-profits, and they wanted to see what is the correlation in this non-profit institutions between the effort that they put in to raise funds, their fundraising efforts, and whether they are successful at that. In other words, is there a vital step between institutions who depend upon fundraising, who have embraced fundraising, and if they have been successful? And they discovered that across all these 87 institutions that they studied, they discovered that having a fundraising plan is key. Could be, and in fact, I think they use the word, the magic sauce. I use the word magic formula. as to what helped them to succeed. And so, on the basis of that, I'm wanting to share with you what I see as some of the essential elements for fundraising in theological education. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process a bit later, because I do think you want to have a sense of what is it that we need to do in order to not just implement fundraising, but to be able to have a measure of success in it. We have to lay the foundations. And as I said, some of that foundations is based upon what I believe Scripture teaches us, that there are some precedents in Scripture. But beyond that, I also believe that there are other principles that we can use that I call the essential elements for fundraising and theological education. And some of these principles are there to help dispel some of the myths that I've spoken about. So let me share this with you, because I believe these are some of the foundational principles that will be necessary as you begin to implement a fundraising plan, and that I'm going to be sharing with you as a process that has been tried and tested, and that I believe that if you implement this process, it's going to help you in your own endeavors. So let me share some of these principles with you. These are principles that I've experienced. They've been taught to me by my mentors, especially the one who had been this full-time Christian fundraiser, and who, since his retirement, has authorized me, has given me the permission to use all of his processes, because I learned them, I experienced them, and to be able to share it within the space and use it in the space of theological education. So the first principle, essential element then for fundraising that I'm wanting to share is this: that we need to develop an understanding that fundraising is part of our ministry. Some people see fundraising as a necessary evil. One could approach it that way. But I think that if we approach the issue of fundraising more positively, that we see it not as a burden to our ministry, but an essential part of our ministry, I believe it's going to help us a lot. Now, let me tell you and share with you the way in which my mentor framed this, as he challenged me when I entered into this process. And this is what he said to me. He said, in its simplest form, we can divide all Christian ministries into three parts. There is ministry, there is management, and there is the money. In other words, we are in the ministry of theological education. That's a wonderful ministry. We've got programs, we've got faculty, we've got so much involved in that. But there's another part of that is very, very important, and that's management. That is part of making sure that what we are doing is being done in a sustainable way, that there's quality, that there's excellence in what we are doing. Because we believe the call to theological education is a high calling, because we are training pastors and missionaries and Christian workers who are entering into what we've always termed as the highest calling God could call somebody to, and we need to make sure that we offer them the best possible service. And therefore, the way in which we run our institutions, therefore, has to be good. So that's the second leg, the second arm, that is management. But in order to make ministry and management happen, we need money. And therefore, ensuring that there are sufficient funds and resources for our particular ministry must be a vital part of what we do. Henry Nouwen wrote a brief booklet on the spirituality of fundraising. And in that, he says this: from the perspective of the gospel, fundraising is not a response to a crisis. Now, I want to pause and I want to say, I know that for many of us, it's because we are facing a crisis that we see ourselves having to do fundraising. And that's fine. Because sometimes, why waste a good crisis? A crisis can often force us to look at things differently and to embrace processes that we might have neglected or we might not have taken note of before. But it shouldn't be that way. Rather, he says, fundraising is first and foremost a form of ministry. It is a way of announcing our vision and inviting other people into our mission. And you will see later on when I talk about, some of the important aspects that he mentions here, what it is all about. We believe, as we have been called into theological education, that's an important ministry. We need to be passionate about it. We need to be enthusiastic about it. But just because we are enthusiastic about it and passionate about it doesn't automatically going to mean that we're going to have all the funding. However, if we can share that passion with people who could be the ones that would be supporting us in ministry, we share our vision, we share our mission, and they see how excited we are about it. They understand how important it is and how vital it is. They then will in all likelihood be able to partner with us. The second aspect that I think that is very important for us, because we are not secular organizations. Yes, we are non-profits, as it were, which, by the way, is, as somebody has said, being a non-profit is simply a tax status. It doesn't mean that we cannot, theological education cannot, in a sense, be profitable and generate more than what we need. But yeah, sometimes we kind of tend to position ourselves in such a way, in which we maybe take on what is called a poverty mentality. I do believe that we need to be humble in what we do, but having a poverty mentality mustn't be confused for humility. And so we need to approach fundraising, for example, from the perspective of biblical stewardship. There's a lot that has been said in this regard. Let me just use this one quote by Vallet, who has written a lot on the aspect of stewardship, one of the great neglected disciplines and principles within our Christian faith. He says this: in the Bible, the steward is depicted as a person who was given the responsibility of managing something belonging to someone else. The steward is thus responsible to the owner. At the same time, the steward is not simply a passive caretaker of what has been entrusted to him or her. The steward is a full representative of the owner. And the question then is, how do we view our responsibilities and our role in theological education? The institutions that we are able to be part of and that we lead, do we see that as our own institutions, or is it that which God has entrusted us to? It is the gift, I believe, that God has given his church, theological education. And therefore, we who have been called into the leadership and the responsibility of theological education, we need to see ourselves as the steward of those gifts that God has given us. And therefore, I'm wanting to say, because this is something I've experienced to be so important, before we can even ask people to be partners with us in the ministry of theological education, we need to demonstrate that we are good stewards of the resources we already have, so that our donors can be confident in us. So if we are mismanaging funds, if we are not following the directives of our donors, and if we are not showing good stewardship in the resources placed with us, by presenting something that is of good quality and a good testimony to the great calling that God has placed upon us, then I'm afraid that we're going to find that many donors will not be sympathetic to our cause, because the impression that they'll get from us that, if we are not good stewards of little, how can we be good stewards of much? And so I believe it is therefore important for us, especially as institutional leaders and those who's going to be involved in the ministry of fundraising, that we maybe need to build a sound theology of both giving and asking. Remember, I'm saying I'm not a proponent of the prosperity gospel, but I am the proponent of biblical stewardship, and one in which we do everything in our own capacity as the Lord enables us, given the abilities that he has given us and given all the gifts that he has given us, to allow that to be used by God with the help of his Holy Spirit, to be able to engage with donors, and to do that on the basis of what I call a sound theology of giving and asking. So my mentor said this to me. He said, well, there are actually there are practically three approaches to Christian fundraising, three ways in which you could approach it. One is you ask God and you tell no one. And that has worked for some people. Some people have approached it and they say they just go to the Lord and they pray earnestly and they fast and they pray and they don't tell anybody, and the Lord supplies their needs. But sometimes the Lord doesn't use that mechanism. Sometimes the Lord uses the mechanism where people ask and they tell other people. In other words, they ask God, but then they go to the people, as we saw that God told Moses to do. Go to the people and ask them. Let them bring their gifts. This happened in the early church as well. Ask God and tell people. Somebody joked and said, faith without hints is dead. And so that's the approach that some people take, and it works for them, but it might not work for others. Yet other people ask God and they ask people. And I have learned to do that, the third way. We ask God, but we also are able to ask people. And so the question to you is, which one do you subscribe to? I know that there's a lot of issues involved in this. Sometimes it's personality. Sometimes it is, your culture that will determine the way in which you do this. But here is then the fourth essential element, the fourth principle that I believe is important as we begin to take a look at how are we going to be building a fundraising program. And that is to build sound partnerships and sound relationships. If there's anything, dear friends, dear brothers and sisters, that you might forget in terms of what I say, then don't forget this one. The fundamental key to fundraising is relationships. It is about building relationships with people, relationships with churches, relationships with organizations, relationships with the people who are going to become your donors. And those donors, if you can view them as your partners in ministry, it just makes the whole process much more meaningful, and I think more in line with what scriptures teaches us. For example, I believe the Apostle Paul, whom was very much dependent in his great ministry of being the apostle to the Gentiles, in not only at times raising his own funds through tent making, but also was dependent upon the donations and the partnership of other people. So much so he can write to the church in Philippians and say, I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership. At the heart of that word partnership is the word koinonia, that we know from our studies in Greek in the New Testament. Your partnership in the gospel from this day until now. And so this is very important. We mustn't just see donors or potential donors as people that can give us money, but we need to draw them into a relationship, not just with us, but with the institution and with the ministry, so that they can also share the same passion that we have. The fifth and the last one I want to make mention of before I start getting into what I would call some of the nuts and bolts then of the process that I'm wanting to share with you is this: keep praying, then ask, and then pray some more. You see, brothers and sisters, we are involved here in a ministry which is not just our own, but we are stewards of that which God has given to us. It is a ministry of great faith. We have to exercise great faith, and we will constantly be challenged in the area of faith. And it is that challenge that I think is kind of concretized when we commit ourselves to prayer, and pray as part of the process that we're involved in. So just as we pray for every other part of our ministry, we also need to pray for the Lord's guidance and direction in all of our fundraising endeavors. I quote now again what my mentor said to me: for there is always our part and there is God's part. And so we can, brothers and sisters, we can teach, we can preach, we can make approaches, but at the end of the day, we recognize that it's only God that can create the desire in someone's heart to give. And only God can open someone's purse or open up their checkbook. And that is why I earnestly believe this, that all of our activities and our endeavors in fundraising has to go alongside the ministry of prayer. So, having then laid that, which I'm hoping is a foundation that you might know, and in which hopefully you would be in agreement with me, but if not, that is fine. I want to now share with you then kind of more tangibly in two sections. One is a very brief one because I want to give you an overview of what I call the fundraising process that I have used in theological education, that I have experience in which I have shared with others in theological education to help them to develop their own processes. And so I first want to then give you what I call a grand overview as to what a fundraising initiative in theological education could be. What are some of the main areas that we are going to need to have in order to establish a meaningful, and if we continue in it, what could develop into and what should develop into a significant initiative in fundraising for theological education. And so this is the process in summary. In each of these areas, there are a number of issues and number of aspects that I think is going to be important. But I'm wanting to highlight it here as a summary. The first part in the summary is we need to have a champion. You need to have a person to be the one who is ultimately responsible for the initiative in theological education. Now, let me just say over here, while I recognize the importance that having a full-time fundraiser could be, in most contexts, it is expensive, and many fundraisers often struggle to be able to meet the targets that are set to them. So and they come at a cost. Some work. Sometimes they work off a standard salary, which is good. But others often work with a kind of an incentive that's built in, where their payment happens off, a percentage of that which they raise. Sometimes that's seen an incentive, but sometimes it actually disincentivizes people as fundraisers. So I'm saying that while there is a place for considering, let's call it so-called or trained, because I'm not wanting to disparage in any way the important role that fundraisers do play, especially within non-profit sectors. I've often seen how this is not the best way for it to happen in theological education, because it often becomes a burden not only to that person but also to the institution. But that doesn't mean we can't have a person to be responsible. I believe that in our context, in theological education, the person who is the institutional head, the principal, the seminary president, the rector, etc., no matter what title you have, I believe that the responsibility of fundraising has to be an important part of your job and your job description. I know that not every one of us is cut out for doing that. And so therefore we could bring another person alongside us, who could help us in that process. But what I'm saying here is that it is important to have somebody or some structure that is able to help you in that regard. And that's why the second part is important. Sometimes it is good to establishing a fundraising committee. Don't make this just the responsibility of one person in your institution. This is very hard work. It's a high stress responsibility, and the turnover rate of people who are even dedicated in the area of fundraising in the non-profit sector, especially in theological education, is very, very high. And, so you could find yourself, running out of steam very, very quickly. But, if we spread that responsibility and we put together a committee, in the context I was in, I was fortunate we were able to establish a fairly high-powered committee that developed into a separate trust that was integrally connected to the institution. But that happened through a process, and it happened because of certain legal demands, that we have within our country. And I'm absolutely grateful to the Lord, that while I played an important role in the whole aspect of it, I had a lot of people who was able to help me. In fact, there were some instances in which I wasn't the only person or the person to ask certain donors. But because we were able to spread that responsibility, we could identify certain people who had the knowledge or the capacity to approach certain donors, whereas there were others that only I could approach. So yeah, having help in that is very important. I believe it's also important in terms of the summary as to what is important within a fundraising process is to be able to have a case for support. You need to be able to present to potential donors a compelling story. And that story must be the explanation and the sharing of your vision and your mission in the form of a story. I believe in theological education. We are involved in a very, very important ministry. But maybe the way in which we are communicating that in itself becomes a burden, becomes a hurdle for being able to draw in, and let me say, the case for support, which often develops into what we call a case for support document, is a document that could serve a number of purposes, not just for the overall fundraising goals of the institution, but also when it comes to specific projects. So I was in a context in which, while we had an overall case for support, there were also smaller versions of it, mini versions of it, that would inform certain projects that we have. Because there are different kinds of donors that you would potentially have, some who are able to give large sums of money, some who are able to give smaller sums of money, but some who are able to support projects, capital projects, building projects, et cetera, et cetera. Projects like developing scholarships for students. Your case for support helps to inform all of those possibilities, because when you approach certain donors, they want to have not a long story, but they want to have a succinct but compelling story that you need to tell them. And that is where the case for support comes in. But then we also need to have help in listing prospects, because at the end of the day, fundraising has a goal of raising resources in which we're going to have to approach people. Yes, we might talk about approaching businesses, or we might talk about approaching churches, but there are always going to be personalities involved in that. You don't talk to a church building, you talk to the people, that are part of that. And there are specific people that you often need to talk to. Sometimes it is the lead minister of the church, the pastor, the priest, whoever could be the person, who's seen to be in charge, But sometimes it is a person who holds a key position within that church or ministry. The chairperson maybe of the finance board, or the chairperson of the missions committee, because they might, through the missions committee, be giving funds. We need to know who those people are that we are going to be approaching, including the potential big donors, your Christian business people, etc. And we need help in that. So we need to be able to have a list. And that list will often be based upon the people who have already given historically. And for that reason, another important aspect of your fundraising in summary is you have to have and you have to implement a donor record system. We need to know who are the people that are currently giving to us, and we have to have a sense of what their history has been with us, because that becomes an indicator as to who or what they might be able to give into the future. And so if we are able to track them, we know how to contact them, we know how to make contact with them, and we have a history of their giving with us, it actually helps us to be able to build on that in terms of our ongoing partnership with them, our ongoing relationship with them. But that often opens up doors to other people. And so we need to have a record of who those donors are. But then I would also want to say, we also need to develop a good thanking program. See, how many of us, when we have received a donation, do we actually thank the donors? I would assume that most of us do that. But there are a number of ways in which we can do that in a way in which we are actually building a meaningful relationship with people. You see, because by thanking here, what I'm also implying is that we need to have a system of ongoing communication. Do you produce a newsletter? Where does that newsletter go to? Does that newsletter also go to your donors as a way of updating them and telling them about, what you have been doing, what the prospects are, what are the challenges that you are facing, what are you seeking to do in the future, And you can do that without asking them. It's a way of keeping them informed. It's a way of keeping them updated and thanking them. And wouldn't it be nice, if your donor were to get a message from you on their birthday, and you should say, I'm thinking about you and I'm praying about you. Thank you for being our partner. That would be so meaningful to so many of them. They shouldn't just be hearing from us once a year when we're going to be asking them, or however often we're going to be doing that. We should rather try to build this relationship. So that's what we mean by developing a good thanking program as a way of communicating with our existing donors and potential donors, and a way of thanking them. We would sometimes keep records in our donor database about changes in family dynamics within some of our donors. Some of them lost a loved one, and then we would send them a message, we're praying for you. I would sometimes ask some of those donors, what is there that I can pray for you this year? We would sometimes send them a small gift, a bookmark, of the seminary, some key Bible verses, and our commitment to pray for them. And then I would contact them, and ask them, how are you doing? What is there that we can pray for you about? So I believe that is also important, right? So that then is the what I would call the essential elements that we need to be involved in terms of the main processes of fundraising. Now, in this last number of slides, I believe that you need to understand and what then is, if there's no magic wand in fundraising and theological education, but there is this need for something which could become a meaningful or a magical formula through what we call an intentional process in fundraising, then I think that a good place to start is to start with developing a fundraising plan, to have at least at the very basic level a plan that will help you in this process. And I want to say that, once again, this is something for which there is a biblical basis. Jesus believed in planning. In fact, Jesus, in this well-known parable in Luke chapter 14, verse 28, said, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to be able to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. And so a fundraising plan is that which, in terms of the bare essentials as to what we should be doing and could be doing in fundraising and theological education, in terms of the process, that I believe is important. And so I want to share with you what are some of the crucial issues, the crucial steps, or the essential elements in developing a fundraising plan. So just in terms of a basic definition, a fundraising plan is an institutional roadmap for a given financial year. You see, you would go through that process of what we call budgeting, where on the basis of, what your actual financial situation was maybe this year, and planning for next year, you might say, well, how much have we actually received from students as far as tuition is concerned? What fundraising, what donations have we received, etc., etc. So you're developing your budget. But in developing that budget, you are then able to identify the funding gap. So a fundraising plan should address some critical issues. In other words, these are some of the areas, some of the important areas that you need to understand in terms of what becomes the goal of your fundraising. The total financial needs beyond the expected or guaranteed income. And what I mean by that is, what is it you're going to be getting from your students? You need to know that. But then, in all likelihood, you're going to have a funding gap in which you recognize, since our students cannot pay completely that which we are going to be giving them and presenting to them, therefore we're going to have to raise some funds through donations, through our third stream income, or maybe through some other resources. And so then what the fundraising plan will do, once you have been able to ascertain what that funding gap is, because that funding gap then becomes your fundraising goal for the year, then your fundraising plan is about planning what fundraising activities will be needed to help reach your target. And in which you could then also state who will lead various activities. Because this cannot just be the responsibility of one person, but by pulling more people into this process, people that could be of support, your board members, for example. What often happens is that many board members, they just warm seats, but board members can and should play an important role as far as their commitment to the institution by sometimes volunteering their time to become part or to maybe even lead one or more of those initiatives. So when you put together a plan, and I'm now going to be talking about what are some of the essential elements of a fundraising plan, this process that will help you in order to be able to raise funds, those are some of the critical areas that it has to address. So let me then share with you in the next few slides, as we draw this presentation to a close, what are some of the essential elements of a fundraising plan? What are those things that I believe has to be there, that you need to think about very carefully, that you need to address, and you need to say, we're going to be embracing this, we're going to be doing this in order to help our processes. The first one is, part of what I mentioned as one of the essential elements is to have an accurate breakdown of expected income and expenses, a realistic budget. There's no way we're going to be able to be successful if we don't have a good idea of what our income and expenses is going to be. We need to have a realistic budget. Now sometimes, and I understand a budget is a faith document, because it is the anticipation and the expectation of that which we are hoping to get. And sometimes we're going to have to adjust that. We're going to have to make some mid-course corrections, along the way. We're going to have to do some reviews, sometimes maybe quarterly, but normally at least once within that year, within the 6-month period, for example, we can do a review as we go towards the end. Some people do it 3 times a year, But that is an important exercise to establish, to at least know what your funding gap is going to be. Because if you have got a good budget, a realistic budget, we will then have a good understanding, a good estimate at least of what the anticipated funding gap is going to be. And then to also answer the question, are we starting the year with a deficit? In other words, we made a loss. we weren't able to meet our needs, and so we enter into the new year with some debt. If you do that, if that happens to you, we need to have a plan to service that debt. And so that then has to become part of our new goal for the following year. But sometimes the Lord blesses us and we've got surplus funds. And so that is therefore a good stepping stone. But we need to have a good idea, as to where we find ourselves, what the funding gap is, and are we starting on the back foot or are we starting on the front foot? So we then also need to be able to understand, and therefore this has to be part of our plan, what worked in the past and what did not work in the past. So because, say, for example, if we identified a particular activity that we decided is going to help us to be able to meet our fundraising goal. We have an event, or maybe we implement a more long-term third stream project. We have to be able to, in the new year, know, has that thing worked? Because, if we expect to get different results doing the same thing and that thing didn't work, we're not going to be getting anywhere. And so what worked, what did not work in the previous year of fundraising, and if something worked, are we able to do it again? And then what should also then be part of the fundraising plan are the activities. There are various activities that is going to be necessary in order to be able to help us to reach the target for our budget. What activities should you plan? What actions for the new financial year that we will need in fundraising? And then also, who is going to be responsible for the various fundraising activities? Once again, in some instances, we sometimes make this responsibility of one person, but that is not going to be helpful. This is something in which we need to engage more people. There could be members of the board. There could be people in your community who you could call upon. Sometimes even the students could help you in some of these endeavors. The faculty could also help. And then determine what sources you will target. So besides events, there are other actions in which, for most of us in theological education, it's going to mean approaching specific donors. And those donors, in all likelihood, are going to be individuals who are going to be giving major gifts, and some who are going to be giving smaller gifts. My own experience has been that the most significant movement we've been able to achieve in theological education, as far as our fundraising goals is concerned, is by being able to attract and to develop donors, individuals, people who are often affluent, of means, who give significant gifts. We have not despised the many smaller gifts, but the goal of being able to really move forward comes through being able to achieve having a good number of major individual donors. But then there are churches, there are foundations and trusts, there are businesses, and there are also events, as well as any other things that might work within your context. So in other words, your fundraising plan has to take that funding gap and has to find expression in terms of its targeting, in terms of its goal, with all of these potential sources of income. How much do you think you're going to be getting from individuals? How much do you think you're going to be getting from churches? But maybe there are additional individuals, additional churches that you're going to be targeting. And so we set goals in each of these that then will ultimately contribute to achieving our overall goal. So in other words, being able to track the history of each and attempt an increase should always be part of our fundraising plan. And this was something that we did, especially when we had what we call our major donor campaign. We would often do this twice a year, once at the end of the tax year and once at the end of the financial year when some people would get bonuses, or they would get some other windfalls, and what we would often do is in our conversation with them, we would inform them as to, and thank them, obviously, which we have done on numerous occasions, for that which they have given us. And then we would make our request and ask them, can we count on you either equaling what you had given us, and we would tell them what they gave us, or can we look at them increasing, if not now, sometime in the future? And that became an intentional way of being able to help us to meet our targets. Then we also need to consider the potential costs of each activity, because sometimes we plan events, and then those events are actually not a profitable event, but it's an event in which we actually lose funding. So we have to do that. We have to know that. But sometimes we have to spend money in order to make some more money back. And then we also need to consider how in our plan we are wanting to move beyond just sustainability, but to move towards advancement. As I said, having the fundamental goal of just meeting your target is very good. But we shouldn't just leave it there. We should try to be able to have some kind of forward momentum. And so the fundraising plan, I believe, should also be able to incorporate that. And then what is also important within the fundraising plan, to set clear and realistic timelines for each of those activities. And so it has to be within a year. It has to be realistic. Because we mustn't try and plan everything at the end. We must try and pace ourselves. We must try and spread it out. There are some activities that's going to be taking place over a number of months. In other words, when you're going to be contacting donors. But obviously, events and other activities needs to have and should have a clear timeline associated with that. And then finally, track your progress. And then evaluate each activity at least once towards the end of the campaign, and then obviously right at the end of the campaign. And so those then are what I would call the essential elements within a fundraising plan. And so, friends, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity that has been granted to me to share with you my experiences and my insights in what I found meaningful and successful in terms of fundraising and theological education. I'm continuing to do this work. I've been working with some institutions, specifically, as well as others. I've also worked with some churches when it comes to helping them in what do they need to put in place, to be able to look at specific projects, for example. And so working in partnership with ACTEA, I know that some of you are going to be interested in this. You're going to want to know more. And so I'm willing, I'm not a fundraiser. I see myself as a consultant in helping people to build their capacity in fundraising. And so I'll be very happy to do that for you. And so that is the end of my presentation.